December 11, 2025. It's year 4, day 291 since the full-scale invasion began. A warm welcome, I greet you. For the Daily Situation Report, in today's report, we see the massively expanded use of fiber optic drones near Kupiansk. Recent Ukrainian strikes on central Russian energy and chemical sites, including the Filanovsky offshore platform and the rising desertion rate in the Russian army, highlight structural decline and deep moral erosion, and of course, much more. But before that, let's take a quick look at the ongoing donation campaign. We've already reached 20% after 4 days. Top notch as always. Don't forget that I donate another 4 cents for every new subscriber. Your subscription is free, yet it still supports humanitarian aid. All info, PayPal, and bank details are in the video description. The money goes straight to Ukraine for Berlin and is also tax deductible. Towards Kupiansk, a familiar scene is now visible. Thin, shimmering strips hang over 2 parts of the forest area in the sunlight. These fiber optic cables connect countless remotely controlled drones. The number of fiber-connected systems there is so high that the cables almost completely cover the area. This illustrates both the intensity of drone deployment and the increasing importance of fiber optic drones for resistance to electronic warfare. When you think about the fact that a video from a fiber optic drone a year and a half ago, or even just a year ago, was considered a very noteworthy event. Since they were so rarely seen, this development is a striking example of how quickly some innovations are implemented, improved, and spread on both sides. Russian Telegram channels are reporting an attack on the Akron chemical plant, one of the largest chemical factories in Russia. The plant produces, among other things, precursor materials that also affect the production of explosives, since they are used for that purpose. The full impact of the attack remains unclear, but that wasn't all. Recent reports say Ukrainian drones have, for the first time, struck the Russian Filanovsky offshore platform in the Caspian Sea. Lukoil's facility is seen as a key production site in the region. It was reportedly hit by at least 4 strikes, after which the extraction of oil and gas from more than 20 wells was halted. The deposit is estimated at about 129 million tons of oil and 30 billion cubic meters of gas. So the attack is likely to significantly affect the export potential via the Caspian Pipeline Consortium. What is the reason for all the attacks on oil and gas facilities? The ongoing Ukrainian attacks on oil, gas, and chemical facilities are pursuing several interconnected goals. Ukraine is directly targeting Russia's criminal war economy, including oil fields and refineries, are essential components of military logistics, as they provide fuels, lubricants, and precursors for explosives. Any failure of such facilities disrupts the supply to the front and weakens Russia's operational capabilities. However, they also frustrate citizens and cause shortages. Secondly, these strikes target the financial base of the Russian state. Oil and gas exports are still one of Russia's most important sources of revenue. If production capacities are reduced or transport routes are disrupted, export volumes and revenues decrease, while costs and risks for deliveries increase. This made it more difficult for Russia to finance the war in the long term through energy revenues. Thirdly, and this is a point that unfortunately many people do not consider, are the attacks having an impact in the geopolitical and economic environment of Western actors? Parts of the United States investor and lobbying environment, especially around Trump, are pushing for a quick end to the war that would allow for a broad reopening of Russian energy projects. The goal of these circles is to enter Russian oil and gas infrastructure as cheaply as possible after a political deal, an interest that is also reflected in many proposals, investment models, and discussion partners. Ukrainian strikes, however, make these facilities riskier, damage their profitability, and reduce the potential value of future investments. This weakens those lobbying structures that prefer an end to the war primarily from an economic perspective and with a largely intact Russian energy sector. In other words, Trump and his lobbyist allies, who strongly backed him in the election, should lose incentives to push Ukraine into a quick peace that would limit their facility investments. Because a purchase like Nord Stream 2, for example, is only possible if the war has ended. And then that has already been proposed. The only major movement on the front took place today in the Liman area and projected, and if ever never modified, at halftime Limanosis Re Hiroyuki. Hunchkire, zdravstvuyte. Over here, the Russians are also trying to achieve significant gains for the 21st Brigade. This area may be under Russian control now. There's still one crossing, but I haven't heard from Ukrainian soldiers here in a while. That means you could consider this area a gray zone. A bit further south, there is hardly any change. Near Yampil. As I said, I assume the place is already under Russian control. They continue attacking west toward Lyman and simultaneously here. That's from yesterday, so the dark red territorial change isn't current. That's about how it looks. But as I said, there's also heavy fighting here, although there hasn't been any new change today, but still. As I said, the Russians have captured 3 villages up here. On the topographic map, the whole thing looks different again. The Russians control the entire ridge northwest of Liman and continue to fight for control of the city near Siversk. If they manage to advance further there, it's quite conceivable that they would also want to capture the hills here south of Liman in order to put pressure on both Liman and Sloviansk. The problem is that all 3 places are located in the valley, and by controlling the hills, the Russians will gain many advantages in preparing their attack. The Russians also attacked near Pokrovsky with mechanized forces, but Ukrainian drones destroyed them completely. You can find the full video, as always, on my Telegram channel. Dmitry Medvedev stated that Russia was able to recruit more than 400,000 contract soldiers for deployment in Ukraine in 2025. That's an average of 33,333 per month, slightly below last year's figure. But it still clearly indicates the scale of the ongoing mobilization and the high personnel attrition. In several regions, significant financial incentives are still in place for those who sign up. Elsewhere, a soldier's yearly pay now tops 6 million rubles, or roughly $75,000. That is, if he survives or if the payment is actually made. This means that within a year, recruits receive the equivalent of 6 to 10 average annual incomes, which of course provides a strong incentive. But 400,000 new soldiers isn't necessarily a lot, because that's only a few thousand more than Russia's annual losses. Additionally, they also have a problem with deserters because the Russian rate of desertion has increased drastically in recent months. Of course, that doesn't mean the Ukrainians don't have deserters. On the contrary, they have their own problems, and those numbers are also high. But here we have a new update on that. Internal Russian documents cited by the Times report about 70,000 deserters in 2025. That's just under a fifth of their recruits. Individual soldiers' reports reveal why desertion is soaring. Because from the Far East comes a lawyer named Nikolai who volunteered for military service. He describes that he enlisted out of economic hardship and in the expectation that the war would end soon. After 10 days of training, he was sent to Mariupol and then the front line. There, he realized that signing a contract was basically equivalent to a modern form of serfdom. There is no right to discharge. Mobile phones and documents are confiscated, and especially assault units are suffering massive losses. In his unit, only 5 out of 45 soldiers survived until July. The supply situation was primitive. Fallen soldiers often lay for days, and everyday neglect shaped the picture. When the next attack order came, he wounded himself with a grenade, a small way out, not to die in the next assault. Another soldier, Anton, 27, who was previously drafted into the Navy, reports catastrophic living conditions in the positions. Rattling mouse infestations are everywhere, as well as chronic exhaustion and a lack of prospects. His moral breaking point came when an Orthodox priest blessed the weapons and justified the war. Anton then lost all conviction, fled from Russia, and describes the soldiers at the front as rotting in their dugouts. Alexander, 21, a train attendant opposed to war, was drafted in 2024 as the 3rd affected person. For financial reasons, he also signed the contract that extended his military service. While in a combat position in Donetsk, he saw military maps being routinely altered, especially before visits from high-ranking officers. The obvious forgeries, as well as the daily visible destruction, led him to desert during his home leave. All three cases were marked by the neglect of the war. The neglect of the war. For the neglect of the war, the neglect of the neglect of the war.